So it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm very honored to be talking to you all today. I When we first moved to the area here, we rented a house in Arlington, so I know Arlington fairly well. We actually rented a house from someone in the State Department, so we were there for 2 years and it had to leave. I've always liked Arlington. We currently live in Bethesda, but I also know some about what you do because we have very dear friends here who are in a similar group here in Bethesda. So you're to be congratulated for your program there for what you do. Let me give you a little background to this story and this book. As I was the chief historian for the National Park Service, and literally the weekend before I started that position, I had been a superintendent at Manassas Battlefield, and I knew quite a bit about different parks in the area, but I did not know about this story. And in the Washington Post, there was an article about a reunion that had taken place at Fort Hunt with a number of former U.S. soldiers who had interrogated Nazis during World War II, a story I did not know about. And so, uh, as I said, I started on Monday after this article came out in the Post. I called the superintendent at George Washington Parkway, who was a good friend of mine, and I said, "I'm really interested in this story. Can I come out and meet with the folks who are doing these oral history interviews?" Now, let me back up just a bit here to tell you how that whole thing happened. Fort Hunt is belongs to the National Park Service, and it has since the 1930s. But during World War II, it became a site where uh, they gave it to they loaned it essentially to the army to bring in the highest value Nazis to interrogate and eavesdrop on their conversations. That was one section. The other section was a document section where they translated and interpreted Nazi documents. And another section was escape and evasion, where they developed a cryptology communication system with prisoners of war, American prisoners of war, and also ways for pilots to be able to avoid being captured. So there all these things happened at Fort Hunt, but the fascinating thing was the Park Service knew absolutely nothing about what happened there until about 2000. And at that time, we started learning a little bit more about it, and eventually we were able to track down some of the people who were actually stationed there. And we were able to interview about 65 of the men who were stationed at Fort Hunt during World War II. And that those interviews are really the main focus of this book. Um, we we did this wonderful project. I When I went to meet with the folks who were doing these interviews, they said that they were just about finished because they had run out of money to do the interviews. Didn't have any more money for travel. So I said, you know what? I'm new at this chief historian job. Maybe I can find the money. So I was able to give them enough money so they could complete all of the interviews, travel to different places. And fortunately, we were able to catch some people, pretty much before they passed away. We interviewed a couple of people who were literally in their deathbeds. At one point, the Park Service historians were literally heading to the airport to catch a plane to Cleveland to interview somebody. The family called and said the man they wanted to interview had gone into a coma, so they canceled their trip. On Monday, the fellow came out of the coma. He said, "Where's the Park Service?" So they were able to get on a plane and go and interview him. So a lot of these, we were very, very fortunate in some cases where we were able to do that. Anyway, I think that's enough of a background. The reason that I did this book was because the story was there. It was a wonderful story, but it seemed to be languishing. It was like, no one had really picked it up to do anything more than the interview. So I thought, well, I think it's probably a good idea for someone to do this, and I guess I'm about as good as anybody to do this story. So that's how I published it. It's done pretty well. The first edition came out during COVID, and I was not able to go to the archives, neither the National Archives or the park archives. So after COVID, there were a couple of things that I was kind of frustrated I couldn't do. So I went to my editor and said, how about a second edition? And she said, great. So it's now in a second edition. This is the paperback edition, and I was able to fill in a lot of the blanks that I was frustrated with from the first edition. So, and if you're interested, you can buy it either hardback, paperback. You can do it Audible, or you can do it on your Kindle. So it's available in several different sources. Okay, here we go. There's all kinds of ways we could start the story, but I think one of the best ways is to talk about the men who were at Fort Hunt. Most of them were who did the interviews and the listened in on conversations and translated documents were either German or Austrian Jews who'd escaped from Hitler and come to the United States, mostly as young children. So you can see this picture here on your right. The young man to the far right of the woman his name is Rudy Pins, and he grew up in Germany. He said that when he was a young boy, he didn't really think much about whether he was Jewish or not Jewish, because there's no big deal whether you were Jewish or Christian or anything. But he said as soon as Hitler came to power, things began to change. And he was fortunate. He said one day he went to school, and the teacher took him aside and said, "Look, you're not going to be able to go on a field trip because you're Jewish." And he said it really knocked him over that was, that he was not able to do that. So his parents found out that there was a program that they could send children who were under 16 to the United States if there was either a foster family or a family, family members who would take them in. And so he left. His family thought Hitler is an aberration. He's not going to stay in power very long, so we'll be able to reunite as a family. That didn't happen, obviously. He never saw his family again. And he was one of the many soldiers who came to Fort Hunt. But most of them, you can see the kid here on the left, they were, just regular, no big deal. Most of them were Jewish, and it was no big deal that they were Jewish because, they were just as like any other kid when they were young. But gradually things became worse and worse for the people who were stationed, who were living in Germany. And some got out with their families, some got out with this program. In fact, there's a wonderful story. A man in Philadelphia was able to convince the Nazis to allow a whole group of children to come to the United States. And this picture is actually sort of an iconic picture of them as they're sailing to the United States, waving to the Statue of Liberty. Again, most of them are very young, and most of them are Jewish. And the reason for them being young, the Americans were concerned, it was during the Depression, as you know, they were concerned that if they brought in adults, they would take away jobs from other Americans. And they thought if they brought in children, it would not be a problem. So this is part of, and there's one chapter in the book, I call it Escape from the Nazis, and I deal with about a dozen, I guess, of the men whom we interviewed who talked about and some of the adventures they had were such that if you read this, if you were reading it as a novel, you'd say, nope, can't be. That's just too wild for a novel. The reality was much more dramatic than a novel could be. When the war started, when the Americans entered the war, one thing they realized very, very early on was that their intelligence gathering operation was pathetic. And so George Marshall, who was the chief of staff, he decided to send a whole group of people, military people from the United States to Great Britain to study what they were doing in World War II and to bring back a report on what they could do. Now, this was interesting because it was before the Americans entered World War II. They were pretty sure they were going to enter, but this was before they entered. They literally came back from UK in December of 1941. And so they came back and they recommended setting up two interrogation centers. One would be on the West Coast to deal with the Pacific Theater. It was a place called Camp Tracy, which was a resort, a very beautiful resort that was turned over to the Army for next to nothing. That would deal with the prisoners that were captured in the Pacific Theater, and the other one was at Fort Hunt. Fort Hunt had been a coast artillery fort built around the turn of the century, around 1900. It became obsolete actually by the time of World War I. It was obsolete, but it was still there, used for different things over time. As I said at the outset, it belonged to the National Park Service, and so they worked out an agreement so that they could use Fort Hunt. And it had a lot of advantages. First of all, it was pretty a lot of the infrastructure that was needed was already there, so that was helpful. Also, it was very close to the Pentagon, just a few miles from the Pentagon, just not too far from Washington, D.C., but far enough away that it was relatively remote. People who lived near it, and they said they knew something was going on, but didn't know exactly what was going on there. So those were all the advantages of Fort Hunt. But the programs they set up were actually there were three different programs. One was the Military Intelligence Section, so MISY, and this was the part that did the interrogations and the eavesdropping on conversations of German soldiers. That was one section. The other one was Military Intelligence Section X, and this was where they did the escape and evasion program. And then the other one was Military Intelligence Research Section, MIRS, and these were the people who translated and interpreted captured German documents. Now, what's fascinating is for the most part, people, especially in MISY and MISX, had absolutely no idea what each one was doing. They were kept separate in the fort, and they really did not know what each other was doing. It's fascinating. Now, the MISX folks knew a little bit about what was going on, and they knew that there were Germans that were there, so they knew that had something to do with it. But exactly what they were doing with these Germans, they didn't know. And the other people in the other two sections had no idea whatsoever what was going on with the escape and evasion section. So these were the three different programs that were at Fort Hunt. Now, Fort Hunt, as I said, was built around 1900, a little bit before, a little bit after. There was a whole big program. I don't need to get into this too far because it was a gigantic program to beef up the coast artillery for fortifications all around the United States. It was a multi-million dollar project at the time. It was real money. They realized that their protection of especially harbors and waterways was pathetic, and they needed to upgrade. So they upgraded Fort Washington, which had existed across the Potomac, and then built Fort Hunt. Now, there's an interesting little side story. Fort Hunt actually was in part of George Washington's river farm. And so there's a history that went back even further than Fort Hunt. Now, there's a little piece in my book, and I don't know if anyone who's read the book noticed this, but to me, it was one of the most fascinating parts of the story, which was when they built Fort Hunt, they finished the fort and putting in all the fortifications. And the last one was installed in January of 1904. Now, what's the big deal about that? Well, in December of 1903, the Wright brothers successfully flew their plane at Kitty Hawk, and with that, all these coast artillery forts became obsolete because they were designed to protect against naval attacks. Now, with airplanes, they were completely vulnerable and they were completely obsolete almost as soon as they were built. So That's one of the fascinating things about Fort Hunt and other coast artillery forts. Now, what did they do? Well, they as I said, the at the beginning of the war, the Americans were had a really pretty pathetic intelligence gathering operation. One thing they knew that they needed to do was to set up a training program so that people that were going to be in this intelligence gathering operation, no matter what it was, could learn what to do. And so they took over a Maryland National Guard fort, actually near the Pennsylvania border, called Camp Ritchie. And they made this into the training center for intelligence people. Now, a lot of the people who were at Fort Hunt actually went through the program at Camp Ritchie, and it was a very, very intensive program that I think was actually very successful. So what did they do there? Well, one thing they would do is they would go through basic training, basic information like you do this, you do that, you do the different things that they might be involved in, and then they would learn to specialize. So one thing they would do now, one thing that's fascinating is that if you would have stumbled on Camp Ritchie in the 1940s, you might have thought that there was actually a German cell here because they had soldiers dressed up in German uniforms. They would go to training in these half-track vehicles. They had every kind of artillery, German artillery there was, so people could tell the difference between what a German cannon and an American cannon sounded like. But one of the major training programs at Camp Ritchie was teaching people how to interrogate German soldiers. So what they would do is they would have an American dress up as a German. You can see the fellow here standing up with the German uniform on, and then the fellow sitting here at the desk. And these German actors would do everything they could to try to trip up the trainees. They would, what's your name? They'd ask what their name was. Well, some of them just refused to give their name. Well, that would frustrate them. One of the funniest and most fascinating stories that I came across was the one of the Germans started talking about uh, a oh gosh a goulash canon. That's a German term. Goulash canon. Now, if you translate it literally, goulash is a German stew, and a canon is a cannon. Well, how does this work? How do you fire goulash out of a cannon, or how does this exactly work? Well, actually, it's a German idiom, which means a field kitchen. Well, the fellow who was trying to interrogate this German got more and more frustrated as this guy talked more and more about this goulash canon. And by the end of it, it's pretty clear that he may not be the right person to do these interrogations. And so the training was very intense, but most people who were there said it was actually very, very worthwhile. Um, so when they would graduate from Camp Ritchie, they would get a certificate like this. Now, this one happens to have some connection with my family, or actually not my family, my wife's family. Her cousin's husband, I guess it'd be cousin-in-law, went through training at Camp Ritchie, and this was his graduation certificate. Now, they took over Fort Hunt. As I said, there was already an infrastructure that was there that was important, but they had to build a lot of things, and so they built the first on. You can see on the left-hand side, this is Section A for a prison. They were able to build this, believe it or not, in 6 weeks. It was just incredible what they were able to do at the time. They had no plans. They just sort of built it and had the plans later. Eventually, it became so crowded that they had to build Section B, which you see here on the right. It was a little bit different design, but this is where they kept the prisoners. Now, if you go to Fort Hunt today, you will not see any of these structures. They were torn down right after the war, so you can't see them. You can see a couple of little remnants here, but that's pretty much it. Now, what was in the fort? Well, one thing that they were very, very proud of was that they'd had these hidden microphones all over Fort Hunt. They would be hidden in the ceilings of their quarters where the Germans stayed. You can see they were fairly comfortable. You know, it wasn't really, it was a prison, but it was not an uncomfortable prison. So they'd listen into conversations there. They would also record the interrogations. And so this is something that they were very proud of because it was a fairly new technology that was available to them. Now, what would happen? Okay, so you see here on the right, you can see the machine on the table to the left on the right hand. This is actually a recording device. They didn't have tapes at the time. The recording materials that they were used looked like a phonograph record. And so they would record the information on there. And then they would type up the interrogation. You can see the typewriter here on the right, and then they would type up everything on the left. So they would have a recording, but they would also have a transcript of almost every single eavesdropping conversation and interrogations. So they had a very good system for recording what they found. How would prisoners be brought to Fort Hunt? Well, there was a bus, blacked out windows. Generally, they'd fly in at night. They'd put them on the bus, or they'd bring them from another location, put them on the bus, and bring them to Fort Hunt. And so they came generally at night, so people wouldn't see that they were bringing prisoners here to Fort Hunt. Now, one of the programs that was very, very successful at Fort Hunt, and it was one of the things that I found really fascinating, was they would try, if they had the sense that a German prisoner was disgruntled with Hitler, and they didn't like what was going on, they would go to an effort to try to recruit them as stool pigeons, or what they call stool pigeons, and it's just like it sounds. These German men would room with other German prisoners and try to get information out of them. And so I had the couple here that are fascinating. One is Lieutenant Kareth. Now he was Austrian. His father, they were from a royal Austrian family. His father had had some trouble with the Nazis. He very, very eagerly became a stool pigeon and had a lot of success. In fact, I listened in on some of his some of the recordings when he was a stool pigeon, and one of them was interesting. He a man that the recording said that the man was whispering. It was hard to understand what he said, but he started talking about torpedoes, these new torpedoes, and got all animated, and his voice went up, and so he was able to get information out of him about torpedoes. The fellow on the right has one of the most fascinating stories of anybody. He was a stool pigeon as well, but his backstory is, I think, even more fascinating in that uh, he was a mechanic for the Luftwaffe, and the Germans found out that his family was Jewish, so he was removed, kicked out of the Luftwaffe, but he was allowed to go to work for the Junker airplane factory, making bombers. One day he got into a bomber that had just rolled off the line. He flew it to an American base, surrendered it to them, along with all of the specs for the plane. And so that was a tremendous benefit, but he also became a stool pigeon and was very successful at it. But there are some tragedies with this program. Everybody who became a stool pigeon knew that if anyone found out what they were doing, they would be in serious trouble. And so this fellow here, you can see here in this picture, his name was Walter Dreschler. Now he was very young. His family, I think his father had been a communist. He had a lot of reason to not like the Nazis. Um, he became a stool pigeon. He was very young, very, very successful in the program. But tragically, what happened was when he completed his work as a stool pigeon, now this would happen. They would stay there for a while, and then they'd be transferred to a POW camp. Well, somehow, and I don't know how this happened, the Army made a horrific mistake. And in this park were the men from his submarine. And so um, he, they found out about it. They had a kangaroo court, and they executed him. They killed him. There's a big, long, huge file in the archives about this whole thing. The Army found out who the perpetrators were. There were 8 men who were involved. They took them to Leavenworth and hanged them. They were the last mass hanging in the United States, the ones who had killed Drechsler. One of the things that worked very well, if a soldier, a German soldier, was recalcitrant, didn't want to really talk about what they were doing, they had the best thing that would work was they had 2 Russian American soldiers dressed up as Red Army soldiers, and so they would start interrogating somebody, and if they didn't want to answer, they'd say, "Oh, well," they'd bring one of these fellows in, dressed in the Russian uniform. They'd say, "You don't want to talk to us? How about if we have Ivan here take you to the Soviet Union? Maybe they would like to hear what you have to say." This worked exceptionally well because the Germans were absolutely terrified of being sent to Russia because they knew what would probably happen to them if they went there. So this was a very successful program. But one thing that was very important, and in our interviews, we found out that the first thing that they wanted us to know was that they never, ever used corporal punishment on prisoners. They never beat them. They treated them very, very well, in fact. They would have all kinds of recreational activities for them at the fort. If they gave them some good information, they might take them to a fancy steak dinner in town. They would take them to movies. They really treated them very, very well. But again, if they didn't want to talk, the best thing that they could do to get them to talk was to threaten to send them to the Soviet Union. And that was a very successful program. One of the program that was there was the Military Intelligence Research Section. And the fellow you see here on the right, his name is Paul Fairbrook. Now, Paul sort of became one of my good buddies. He actually he'd invited me to come to his 100th birthday party, and unfortunately he was in hospice, and so he wasn't in very good shape. But he gave me a tremendous amount of information on this document section. Now, one thing about the Germans was they were fastidious record keepers. In fact, someone who was in this section here said if a German sneezed, they would have a record of it. There was almost that much detail. The good thing was it was great for the Germans because they knew what was going on. But it was also one of the real problems, because once these documents were captured, the Allies could learn a tremendous amount about the programs that were going on in Germany. So, for example, let me give you just a couple of things that they found. Each German had a passbook. If you looked at it, it would look like a passport, and it would document everywhere that they were stationed. Well, this is very useful because they could tell where different parts of the army or military had moved over time. So that was one of the useful things. Another thing that soldiers were required to carry was a card that documented where they had visited a brothel. You might wonder, what? Well, what happened was the Germans had official brothels. Unfortunately, the women who were there were mostly prisoners who were captured. But the German soldiers were required to keep a card where they had been, which brothel they'd been, and who the sex worker was that they were with. Now, of course, the reason for this is if a VD, venereal disease, broke out, they would know where to start to try to correct that. But for the Americans, this turned out to be a real benefit because a lot of men didn't want their mothers, their wives, their girlfriends, or whoever they'd been to a brothel. So they would say, "Oh, I see that you went to brothel number 5 and were with Maria. How was that?" They go, and it had two effects. On one hand, the Germans didn't want people to know about it, so they say, "Well, if you don't tell anybody, I'll tell you what I know." And the other part was, these Americans know so much. If I don't, if they probably know everything that I could tell them anyway, so I might as well tell them. And so this turned out to be one of the real benefits of the documents collection program. But also sometimes they would have the folks who ran this section. By the way, the captain who was over this section, his name was John Kluge. And if you don't aren't familiar with that name, in the mid 1980s, he was rated as one of the two richest men in the country, along with Sam Walton. And the reason was he just sold his Metro Media empire for several billion dollars. So he was very wealthy, but he also was stationed at Fort Hunt. So he told a couple of stories about what they would find in this document section that I think was very interesting. So there was a general who was at Fort Hunt. He went to the general and he said, we know that you were at Rommel's daughter's wedding. They'd say, well, how do you know that? He says, well, we were eavesdropping there. We know that. Well, what happened was that they'd found an obscure newspaper from the little town where she was married. There was a photograph in the newspaper that showed this general there. So he said, not only we know that, we know you were standing next to so-and-so. And they just couldn't believe that they would know that. The other thing that they captured was the Reichstag phone book. And they could use that to benefit as well. They could say, we know that you talk to so-and-so on a fairly frequent basis. Well, how do you know that? Well, we had all your phones tapped. So they would have fun with some of the information that they gathered in this program. But probably the greatest benefit that came out of the document section was the publication of different sources. So you can see on the left-hand side, this is called the Red Book. Now, why was it called the Red Book? It had a red cover, but it was the order of battle of the German army, and in it, it would list every single unit of the German military, who was the commander, who was the chief of staff, where they were located, how strong it was. I mean, this is almost the Bible for fighting the Germans, and it was produced at Fort Hunt. Actually, there were, I think, 3 different versions of the Red Book, and this became one of the most valuable things that the Americans had. In fact, it was used very, very extensively for D-Day. They published several other things as well that became very important for fighting the war. I mentioned that there was a escape and evasion program as well at Fort Hunt. Now, what would happen here was that, first of all, if a pilot of a plane was captured, one thing that they could possibly use to get some kind of benefit was a package that you see here to the left, a bribe package. And there was one for the Pacific Theater and one for the European Theater. And sometimes this would be very, very useful to get good treatment if they were captured. So that was one thing. The other thing was they would communicate with prisoners of war in POW camps, and they would say, a package is coming. You need to be on the lookout for it. And what might be in this package, you can see here, this is a cribbage board with the X-ray that you can see in the cribbage board is a communications device that was in. They would send baseballs with transmitters in them. It became very, very successful program, and one of the great, I think, very early on, this cryptology communication system worked, and it was never really, no, I think the Germans never really got on to what they were doing with that program as well. Well, after the war, Fort Hunt continued as a center, but things began to change. So, for example, they were very interested in getting German scientists to come to the United States as the Cold War was beginning to heat up. The other thing was that they were able to learn a great deal from some of the prisoners who were at Fort Hunt. So the fellow you see here on the left shaking hands with Hitler was the Japanese ambassador from Japan to Germany, a fellow by the name of Oshima, General Oshima. Unbeknownst to him and the Germans, the Americans had broken the code for the Japanese transmission system, and in many cases they knew what was being sent from Germany to Japan before Japan knew what was going on. But they brought Oshima to Fort Hunt and interrogated him and got some good information from him. But one thing that I found really, really interesting, and I focused on this in the second edition, were two generals. They were two Luftwaffe generals, Kessler and Aschenbrenner. They were put in a cell to the military listened in on every single conversation for over a month. And what I found fascinating is when they didn't know that they were being that they were being eavesdropped, that there was eavesdropping on their conversation. And so they really had a very interesting take on what had happened during World War II. It was almost like a after action report. Aschenbrenner, in particular, had a lot of valuable things to say about the Soviet Union. He had been the attaché from Germany, the Luftwaffe attaché from Germany to Russia, and he said that the Russians were much better prepared than Germany thought. So when they started talking about going to war, he said it'd be a big mistake because the Russians are far better prepared than you think they are. And of course, it turned out to be a complete disaster. And so he had a lot to say about that. Kessler had a lot to say the Germans attacking England. He made the case that if they attacked England, it wouldn't be too long before the Americans would come in. So their conversations were very useful both to the Americans, but also useful to this book because I got a real good flavor of what they were saying to each other and how they were viewing the German uh, fighting World War II. Um, there were a lot of interesting stories at Fort Hunt, and one of the ones that just tickled me all over the place was the fella you see here on the left. His name was Arno Mayer. He retired as a history professor at Princeton. He was stationed at Fort Hunt. He came there later in the war. He was actually there when the German soldiers were brought there, or I'm sorry, the German scientists were brought there, and they were trying to recruit them. He had an interesting title. He was called a morale officer, and one of his jobs was to try to keep the Germans happy. And so that was a kind of a different role from what they'd had before. But one day, he and a friend were going to New York. Arno Mayer was from New York. He'd lined up a couple of hot dates for them in New York. They needed to get to Union Station, so they went out and hitchhiked on the what became the George Washington Parkway. A car came and picked them up. There were three women in the car, and they drove them to Union Station. And when they got there, they said, "Do you know what General Eisenhower's wife's name is?" No. They called, one of them called Time Magazine and found her name was Mamie. And the reason they wanted to know this was that she kept talking about General Eisenhower. Now, this is after the war. Eisenhower now is the chief of staff in the Pentagon. And so they get to New York and they said, we should write her a letter and thank her for giving us a ride. So they did. They sent a letter and said, thank you for doing this and the other thing. A week later, they're called into their commanding officer's office and they're terrified. They think they're going to be in real deep trouble. Well, they walk into his office and he almost starts bowing to them. And he hands them this letter. And the letter is from General Eisenhower thanking them for thanking his wife for giving them a ride. Um, it's one of these really funny, interesting things. Now, fortunately for us, one of the fellows kept the envelope and the other kept the letter, and they turned him over to us. So now it's in our archives. One of the real fascinating things. There were several historians who did most of the interviews. The one on the right, Byron Bice, was probably the lead trying to do the interviews, but Bent Santucci on the left was the chief ranger at the time, and he sort of directed the program. And in 2007, as I mentioned at the outset, they brought all the people that they could together to have a reunion at Fort Hunt. And at that time, they erected the monument and the flagpole. You can see that some of the men are in pretty good shape, some aren't in very good shape, and it became one of the important stories for Fort Hunt. Paul Fairbrook, as I said, became a very good friend, and a couple years ago, he was on a program on 60 Minutes. They talked about Camp Ritchie in 60 Minutes. And at the end of his afterwards, he came home and he uh, hold on here. See if I can find it. He came home, talked to his rabbi, and he said, and this is one of the best things I saw, and I actually included it in my book. He said, "First, I'm able to revenge in whatever way I could my loss of my uncle, my aunt, cousins, my family to the Holocaust. I had the chance to really do something about that. Second, and equally important, I had the chance to thank the United States for letting me and my family in. Because of that, I, my children, and my grandchildren are all doing well in this wonderful country." And with that, thank you so much. And I'll do your questions now if you'd like.
All right. Well, the first comment we've got is that there is a small but interesting museum at Fort Ritchie about the training programs during the war.
Right. Yeah, they've built a little museum. It's now called Fort Ritchie. And there's some interesting development issues there. They've had several developers who've tried to develop some kind of a retreat, I guess, or housing. But yes, there's a little visitor center and a little museum, and it's actually very nice. And you can actually see a lot of the buildings that were there connected to Camp Ritchie are still there. There's an artificial lake and there's a little resort thing that's on the lake. So if you're interested, you can easily go to what was we called Camp Ritchie, which is now called Fort Ritchie.
Okay. And Margie included a link to the museum's website
Oh, wonderful,
in the
wonderful.
chat. Uh, we also have a question. What happened to the Germans that they brought over here after the war? Did they stay or were they sent back home?
Almost every single one was sent back to Germany, and some made a case to come back to the United States, but almost all of them were sent to Germany. There are a couple. One of the things that fascinating, we were able to track down two German soldiers who had been captives at Fort Hunt, and we interviewed them. One of them had gone back to Germany and then was able to come back to the United States. The other one was actually from Czechoslovakia, and he was allowed to stay, was not sent back. And the reason was that after World War II, Czechoslovakia became part of the behind the Iron Curtain, and so they allowed him to stay in the United States. But that was an exception. So almost all of them were sent back to Germany.
How were they treated when they got back to Germany? Do you know?
I think they were mostly treated pretty well. I don't know of any instance where they were treated badly. Now there were some. There's actually a couple of books that have been written from the German side about some of the German prisoners who were at Fort Hunt, and some of them were pretty nasty people. I mean, they really were. Uh, I mean, some of them actually might have been, psychotic or antisocial. One fellow they talk about who was really, really very proud of killing as many people as he possibly could, went back to Germany and he became a gardener and lived a long and I guess not prosperous, but a long and comfortable life. So I think they generally, as far as I know, I don't know an example, and probably there are some, but I don't know of examples where they were not treated well. Now, I don't know very much really about the East Germany, but I think for the most part they were treated pretty well.
Okay. We got somebody said they missed where you were talking about the kinds of devices that were hidden in the cribbage boards and baseballs. Can you go back and talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So what happened was they would this Fort Hunt. One of the things that they did, this evasion, or I guess the section where they would communicate with prisoners of war. Now, let me back up just a little bit. I didn't say very much about the Luftwaffe, the Luft camps. Pilots Allied pilots were kept in separate prison camps in Germany. They were treated far, far better than other prisoners in other camps. The reason was that Goering had convinced Hitler that if they treated the Allies well, that the Allies would probably treat the German prisoners well. And so they actually were treated much, much better than other prisoners and other prisoners of war camps. But they developed this, the Americans developed this cryptology program, and we're actually able to talk to the fellow who developed that program. His name was Silvio Bedini, and we literally talked to him. If you look at his tape from when he talked to him, it literally was in his, I mean, interviewed him in his bed. That's, I mean, how close it was to not being able to find him. And he talked about how he developed this system. It was very simple. And so they would send a cryptology letter, and he said it was really important to recruit soldiers who were not very good writers. You go, what? Well, they wanted to get soldiers that were not very good writers because the Germans wouldn't be suspicious that it was someone, you know, in a high level that was writing these letters. And so they would write letters and say, you know, such and such is coming, package is coming, and you need to be on the lookout when it comes because it's going to have different things in it. So one example was the cribbage board with with the transmitter in it. Baseballs, they sent baseballs with transmitters in them. They would send like a Monopoly board, and if you peeled the board apart, inside the board would be maps of the local area, uh, German work permits, money, Deutschmarks, anything they could find to either make the lives of these prisoners a little easier so they could communicate with the outside with these transmitters, or if someone would try to escape, they would have a mechanism by which they could probably have some success if they could escape and have things like a map or German money or so forth. So that's how that system worked, and it worked. It worked so well. By the end of the war, they were actually sending guns in, and they were able to get guns through. They were and successfully. What they would do is they put these packages together at Fort Hunt, then they'd take them somewhere like Baltimore and send them, and it'd be some bogus nonprofit company that was sending these packages to the POW camps.
Next question is, as former chief historian of the National Park Service, what topics did you focus on? And is there a chief historian now? And if so, what is their scope of work?
Well, the easiest one for me to answer is the last one because yes, there is a chief historian, and I know her, but I've not really talked to her very much in the last few years, so I'm not sure what the current focus is. So I can't really answer that very well. But what I can tell you is that one of the main things I did as chief historian, both and when I was at Manassas Battlefield, was to gear up for the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And we published a number of books. There was one called The Civil War Remembered. We did one on American Indians in the Civil War. We did another one on Reconstruction. We did several publications, but the main thing that we did that I was very proud of, both at Manassas and as chief historian, was to try to expand our interpretation of the Civil War to get not so much to do away with, because we certainly didn't want to do that, but to expand beyond who shot who, where, when, and how. If you go to a Civil War battlefield, they'll tell you every detail there is about the battle. We don't want to change that because it's a very, very successful part of the program. But what we wanted to do was to say, why were they fighting in the first place? What were some of the issues that led to the Civil War? And the main focus of that whole program was slavery. And we said slavery was the principal cause of the Civil War. Now, there are some who didn't agree with that to such a degree that my buddy, who was a superintendent at Gettysburg, one time gave a talk, and he said slavery kind of, sort of, a little bit, more or less, had something to do with the Civil War. And within a week, there were 1,100 cards and letters sent to the Secretary of Interior demanding that he be fired for saying that slavery had something to do with it. And when I was at Manassas Battlefield, uh, Manassas had one early on belonged to the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and they were getting ready to file a lawsuit to take Manassas back from, as they said, the corrupt and anti-Confederate National Park Service. So it was not. We got some threats for saying that slavery was the cause of the Civil War, but I think we felt like that was one of the real successes we had, was expanding the interpretation of the Civil War era beyond the who shot who, where, when, and how. And of course, being chief historian, I had a lot of other things going on as well. One of the things that was very important to me, when I gave money to the folks at Fort Hunt to go do their oral history interviews, I insisted that they work with other parks in the areas where they were doing some interviewing, to try to develop a network of parks that had something to do with World War II. And what was fascinating was there were a lot of parks that had World War II stories, but that wasn't the main focus of the park. So, for example, um, uh, uh, Prince William Forest Park, which is in Prince William County, sort of the very bottom of was developed as a camp for mostly for inner city kids during the Depression. But during World War II, the OSS took it over as their training program, and so that's a story that's important there. And out in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Park has a lot of different parts that are dealing with World War II, and so I got them all working together, and I was actually very proud of getting them to work together on different programs. So that was one of the focuses. And of course, every day something would be a little different. I would come to work and say, well, I'm going to do such and such, and something would come up and I'd have to do that. But I tried to develop programs like that where I could get parks working together on the Civil War, World War II, different things. And I think that I felt fairly good about that.
Okay, we have another question. Did any of the German prisoners at Fort Hunt escape?
Okay, there's one story, and this one prisoner, his name was Hanke. He was a U-boat captain, and he was at Fort Hunt. He had been very, very successful. He was actually one of the stars of the U-boat program. He had sunk, I don't remember how many tons of primarily British commercial shipping. He was at Fort Hunt. He somehow was convinced that he was going to be turned over to the British, who were going to try him for war crimes. And so what he did in the middle of the day, he ran out, started climbing the fence to escape, and one of the guards shot him and killed him. And that is the one example that we have where someone actually tried to escape. But we think it's more, since it was the middle of the day, we think it's that he was actually trying to commit suicide by having a guard shoot him. That's the only one we know of. I saw some of the interviews talked about other possible escapes, but when I tried to track down the information, I thought it was a little shaky, so I didn't include it. But that's the only one that's documented.
Okay, well, it's 11 o'clock. So if there are any other questions, oh, here we go. Somebody said, did I miss this? How did these German prisoners get to Fort Hunt? Could you talk about that
Well,
again?
yeah, no, I'd said a little bit about it, but I'll say it a little bit more. I'll say a little bit more. So generally what would happen, they'd be captured in the European theater. Well, actually early on they were from U-boats that were captured mostly off the coast of the United States or somewhere. So most of the early ones were U-boat. Later, they were captured in the European theater. All of them were, if they were captured in Europe, they would go through an initial phase of interrogations, and in some cases, they would leave them there because they had valuable information that they could use right there. In fact, there's one wonderful story I didn't include, but I'll tell you now, which I think is worth repeating, which is one of the men who was at Camp Ritchie. He was still alive when I did my book, so I talked to him. His name was Guy Stern, and he just died a year ago. I think he was 101 or 102. But he and his buddy had this system in Europe where they would interrogate a German prisoner. His buddy would start the interrogation. He was the good cop. Guy Stern would dress up as a Russian officer, Commissar Krukov, and if the first one didn't work, they'd send him to Commissar Krukov, and he had a real thick German accent. On the wall in his tent, he had a picture signed by Joseph Stalin. He said, "To my comrade, Commissar Krukov from Joseph Stalin." Of course, all baloney. But that actually worked very, very well. But what would happen is they would do the initial interrogation in Europe. They would send them to a place called Pine Grove Furnace, which is north of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. And there they would go through another level of interrogation. And once they were there, they would be sent, if it would look like they had some valuable information, they'd be sent from there to Fort Hunt. Some cases they come directly to Fort Hunt from wherever, flown into Bowling Air Base and sent to. But generally, what would happen? They'd come in at night there was a bus. I showed a picture of the bus that was blacked out, and that's how they get to Fort Hunt. The one thing that they couldn't do was to accommodate a whole large group of German soldiers at one time. So that's why they had this Pine Grove Furnace in Pennsylvania as sort of the initial holding place.
Okay, well, it sounds like it's about 11:03, so we are finished with the program today. We want to thank Robert Sutton for giving us a really very comprehensive overview of his book, Nazis on the Potomac. Excellent presentation, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, and so I just wanted to remind everybody next week at 10 o'clock, the topic will be Central Union Mission. And our guest will be Joe Metamano, who is the mission president and CEO, and he'll talk to us about the Central Union Mission and what is the services. So be sure and tune in next week at 10 o'clock on Coffee and Conversation. So have a good week.